It's one of those stories that so many of us know, or at least we think we know it. You know the one: a perfect garden, a talking serpent, a forbidden fruit, and the one choice that changed everything. So let's dive deep into one of the most foundational stories in the entire biblical tradition, the account of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden from Genesis chapter 3.
Here's our game plan for this explainer. We're going to unpack this whole story piece by piece. We'll start by looking at how the book of Genesis actually kicks off, which is a little surprising. Then we'll walk through the temptation and what happens after. And finally, we'll zoom out to understand where this story came from and how it fits into the bigger world of ancient myths.
All right, so the first thing you need to know about Genesis is that it presents us with this really fascinating literary puzzle. See, it doesn't start with one creation story, it actually starts with two of them, right back to back, and they both have a completely different vibe. And you can really see the contrast here. On one hand, you have Genesis 1. Scholars call this the priestly source. It's this huge, majestic, cosmic story where God, called Elohim, creates everything in 6 perfect days just by speaking. But then Genesis 2 hits, and it's like the camera zooms way in. This is the Yahwist, or J source, and it's a much more personal, hands-on story. Here, God, Yahweh Elohim, is like a sculptor, forming man from the dust. Our story, the one about Eden, comes from this second, much more intimate account. So, who wrote this second story? Well, scholars call the author the Yahwist, or just J, because they use God's personal name Yahweh. This is believed to be the oldest layer of writing in the first 5 books of the Bible, giving us a peek into some of the most ancient Israelite traditions. Okay, so let's get into the narrative itself. The scene is the Garden of Eden. It's a paradise. The first humans, Adam and Eve, are there, and they have literally everything they could possibly need, with just one single rule to follow. And this right here is the crucial point. God sets up a choice. As many scholars point out, humanity is essentially offered a choice between wisdom and life. God seems to intend them for life, but the choice is theirs. And it's all symbolized by these 2 trees, the tree of life and the one that's off limits, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And this is where the serpent slithers onto the scene. He's portrayed as this incredibly cunning, deceptive creature. He gets into a conversation with Eve and starts twisting God's words, planting seeds of doubt. The serpent basically says, "Nah, you won't die. In fact, if you eat this fruit, you'll be like gods, knowing good and evil." So, the choice is made. Eve takes a bite, and she shares the fruit with Adam. But the result isn't exactly what the serpent promised. It's not physical death, not at first. Instead, there's this profound shift in their awareness. Suddenly, their eyes are opened. They see that they're naked, and for the very first time, they feel shame. Their innocence? It's gone. This new feeling of shame makes them hide from God, which, as you can imagine, sets the stage for a really dramatic confrontation and a whole series of consequences that are going to shape the rest of the human story. I just love the imagery here. God isn't some distant, untouchable being. The text says he is walking in the garden in the cool of the day. It's such a personal, almost human-like description. And when he calls out to Adam and Eve, they're hiding. And then, of course, the blame game begins. Adam blames Eve, and Eve turns around and blames the serpent. God then lays out 3 judgments or curses. Now, what's really fascinating is that a lot of scholars see these as etiological explanations. That's just a fancy word for origin stories. They're ancient ways of explaining why the world is the way it is. Why are people and snakes enemies? Why is childbirth so painful? And why is farming such backbreaking work? This story gives a theological answer to those questions. And then comes the final consequence: exile. They are driven out of paradise, and this is the ultimate loss. Why? Because by being banished, they're now cut off from the tree of life, which means they've lost their access to immortality. So now that we've walked through this story, let's zoom back out and take a closer look at the author behind it, because understanding the unique style and perspective of this Yahwist source is absolutely key to getting what this story was originally about. The Yahwist source has a really distinct fingerprint. First, it always uses God's personal name, Yahweh. Second, it presents God in very human-like terms. That's called anthropomorphism. And finally, it tells these really intimate, character-driven stories about human drama and our relationship with God.
And we've already seen the perfect example of this, right? A God who walks in a garden, who talks directly with people, who asks questions, who even personally makes clothes for Adam and Eve. This is not the distant cosmic creator from Genesis 1. This is the up-close, personal, relational God of the J-source. Now, this is a really important point. The terms we use all the time, like the fall or original sin, the whole idea that this one act corrupted human nature forever, those words are not actually in the original Hebrew text. They are much later theological ideas, developed famously by Christian thinkers like Augustine. The original story is way more focused on the immediate consequences, like hard work and mortality, not on some kind of inherited cosmic stain on humanity. Okay, let's broaden our view one last time. You have to remember, the ancient Israelites were not writing this stuff in a vacuum. They were living right in the middle of these huge, powerful empires like Mesopotamia and Egypt, and their stories were definitely in conversation with the common ideas of that world. And this is where it gets really clever. What the authors of Genesis did was take these familiar ideas and story elements from other cultures and completely reframe them to get across their own unique monotheistic worldview. It was kind of like a debate with the myths of their neighbors. And just look at these parallels here. The loss of immortality because of a serpent? That sounds a lot like the famous Epic of Gilgamesh, where the hero has a plant of eternal youth stolen by a snake. A human who misses out on eternal life because of a tricky choice? That's the core of the ancient myth of Adaba. These themes, sacred trees, chaos serpents, they were all over the ancient world. But, and this is the game changer, while Genesis uses these familiar building blocks, its message is absolutely revolutionary for its time. In many Babylonian myths, humans are basically created to be slaves for the gods. But in Genesis, humanity is the pinnacle of creation, made in God's own image, and given responsibility over the earth. That is a profound theological statement. So, as we start to wrap up, what does all of this mean for how we should read this ancient, incredibly powerful story? Well, it's pretty clear that if you walk away thinking this is just a simple little fable about why you should listen to your parents, you're missing out on some incredible depth and complexity. No, this is a masterwork of ancient literature. It pulls from some of the oldest storytelling traditions we have, but it reworks all of them to ask these massive questions about human freedom, about responsibility, about why we die, and about our relationship with the divine. And that leaves us with one final thought to chew on. When we peel back the layers of a story like this one, when we can actually see the different authors, the cultural conversations, the theological debates happening behind the scenes, it doesn't make this story less powerful. If anything, it enriches it, showing us a text that is far more complex and maybe even far more meaningful than we ever imagined.